Dear friends and colleagues, a very warm welcome to the second linguistic flash mob organized by the Linguistic Aperitif Group. Since the initiative has been well received and we have now gone beyond European borders with guests from Japan, China, and the US and Canada, we have decided to go on with the initiative and organize one flash mob every 3 weeks, always on Thursday evening at 18:30 Central European Time. The format for tonight is the same as last time. Two discussants will deal with the problem as to how we can derive functional hierarchies this time. So we welcome today Guglielmo Cinque from the Ca' Foscari University of Venice and Peter Svenonius from the University of Tromsø. As last time, they will debate 3 questions on this topic and give us their view in the form of a contest. Tonight's moderator is Alessandra Tomaselli from the University of Verona, who will ask the questions, summarize, and comment the results. We then open the discussion. As last time, you will have the opportunity to ask questions, and for those of you who are following us on YouTube, please write to me to my email address, ceciliapoletto@gmail.com, and I will read your questions to the speakers. For security reasons, the chat, microphone, and screen sharing facilities will be disabled during the debate, but the chat will be active at the end for you to write if you intend to ask a question, and we will enable your microphone. Those of you who won't be able to ask their question can send it to me via email. I will collect the questions and send them to the speakers for a later reply. As last time, the event is being streamed on YouTube. So if you keep your screen active or ask a question, you are implicitly giving your consent to be streamed and recorded. Please feel free to distribute the link on YouTube of the registration you have received with a flyer to your students, colleagues, and post it on your social media. And now I leave the floor to Alessandra Tomaselli, who will moderate tonight's epic battle in linguistic history.
Thank you, Cecilia. Hi, everybody. Good evening. It's really an honor for me to play the role of moderator during the second linguistic flash mob. The first one, as Cecilia said, was devoted to the concept of parameter and its role, or better to say, its space within the theory of universal grammar. This second one focuses on functional hierarchies. Our special guests are Guglielmo Cinque and Peter Svenonius. Many thanks to both Memo and Peter, who have accepted to take part in the debate and to play the role of contenders around the topic functional hierarchies. Before asking the first question, I want to thank Cecilia, who had the crazy idea to propose this new format of discussion. I think without being completely aware of all the complications which have followed, but we are glad she was not completely aware. And a special thank to her technical committee who support us and Cecilia step by step. The 3 questions which will guide the debate have been discussed and elaborated by an informal group of women linguists who initially met just to chat via Zoom and to have a cup of coffee together, or even better, a glass of wine, and eventually ended up in this unexpected and possibly far-reaching sequence of international Zoom meetings. So let us start with the first question, which is the following. So paraphrasing Chomsky, Gallego, Ott, 2019, is it imaginable that these hierarchies could have evolved as irreducible properties of UG? If not, how are they learned? In simple words, what is the language acquisition model that you envisage? I think it's better that Memo start answering and then Peter will follow. Okay, so I give the word to Memo.
Okay, so I don't need to do anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just okay. Well, before I start, I wanted to say that rather than epic battles, I would title the series Exchanges of Tentative Ideas. So let me start with some tentative ideas relating to the last part of the question, namely, are functional hierarchies learned? Now, that's most unlikely for several reasons. It's even assumed without argument by Chomsky, Gallego, and Ott in their article. For one thing, if functional hierarchies were not given, why should all languages give evidence for the same hierarchies to begin with? Also, why do we find that only some functional elements are encoded grammatically in all languages, and other equally possible, equally plausible ones are never so encoded? I'll come back to that. A third consideration is that many languages don't give evidence for some functional projection. And yet we find some more indirect, subtle evidence to postulate, nonetheless, this projection. So take Bangla, for example, which has no determiners, hence, possibly, one could say, no DP. Yet, Syed and Simpson have argued that we have to postulate DP even in Bangla for some specific reasons. So, for example, Bangla has the order like in English, two nice children, but it also has the order nice children too, which gets interpreted as the two nice children, suggesting that a projection of the noun phrase overtakes, crosses over the numeral, plausibly to spec of DP, which when activating a projection that normally is silent, but it's activated if it contains a plus definite feature or something. And this is only true for lower numerals, up to 5, not for higher ones. So it's very special. Now, such cases, I think, could be easily multiplied. Now, if these functional hierarchies are not, these are unwanted, sorry, are not learned, are they part of UG? This requires actually a somewhat more elaborate answer, which I will postpone to the next slot, to the next question. And I will actually suggest that UG is crucially involved, despite some apparent evidence. And so I take now the language acquisition model part of the question. And if you think, I mean, the underdetermination of the primary data, the rapidity of acquisition, suggests that acquisition should be quite trivial. Not too trivial, though. So take, for example, the acquisition of linear order parameter. An idea that has gained wide acceptance about how to treat linear order is that the physics of speech leave just two options on the PF side, so that a head can either precede or follow its complements or modifiers, whatever. However, that's too simplistic because it falls short of accounting, I think, for a number of generalizations. One of these generalizations is the fact that if you, I mean, the combinations of elements that should be expected are only a superset of what you actually get. So, for example, if you take 3 elements, like maybe it could be numeral, classifier, noun, or intensifier, adjective, noun, of the 6 theoretically possible combination of these elements, only 4 are attested. And this carries over to any other combination of elements. More importantly, I think, is the fact that to the right of a head, more orders are possible than to its left. This is true not only for the nominal extended projection, let's say Greenberg's universal 20, it's all over the place. It's in all domains, you find the same left-right asymmetry. So clearly, it seems to me that the physics of speech cannot help us understand what is ruling, the ordering of the elements, even in a very apparently well-studied parameter like the linear order parameter. And nonetheless, I think that both for the acquisition of this parameter, which is inextricably, I would say, tied to hierarchies, I think it's possible to envisage a simple set of assumptions that can account for these generalizations and for the acquisition. And these assumptions are the following. The hierarchies, with their fine articulation of sub-projections, are given. Word order is ultimately a function of movement. I mean, this has been argued extensively by Richard Kane in a number of works. Here specifically, what one can move is just the head of each sub-projection of the extended projection in one of the possible ways that you have movement, like, with or without piping. And these new hierarchies that are obtained from the given hierarchies, which are known linearized, are obtained through VRCA. I mean, that's the algorithm that even Chomsky had in '95, and which I think is the best algorithm yet to map hierarchical order to linear order. So in that sense, I think that at least these relatively simple set of assumptions promise to account for the possible and impossible orders found across languages. And although I cannot now expand on it, of course, but it seems that both the generalizations and the crucial question for universal grammar, for our theory of grammar, is not so much, or not only, let's say, to capture the strong tendencies of head initial and final languages, but our main task is to account and derive which orders are possible and which orders are not possible. And I think that movement is at the basis, exactly at the basis of this discrimination.
Okay.
I'll stop here.
Peter?
Okay, is my sound on? All right, thanks. I'm not going to address the word order issues directly. I want to focus on the functional hierarchy. And I made some slides. I haven't used this format before, but
The screen, okay.
Can I share my slides like this?
You did.
Are they now visible? Okay, and if I scroll through them like that, you'll be able to see them. Is that okay? So, I'm going to draw on the paper that Gillian Ramchand and I wrote and published in 2014 in the journal Language Sciences, where we argued that part of the hierarchy is universal and rigid and fixed and very robustly attested. And that's roughly the C over T over V hierarchy, but also possibly with two transition points, the category that allows a transition from the C domain to the T domain, which we called Finstar, and the category which allows a transition from the T domain to the V domain, which we called ASP star for aspect. So we argued for essentially 5 tiers in the clause as part of a universal ordering. But of course, Cinque 99 in 2004 has at least 15 positions in between what we call Finstar and what we call ASP star. We have finite verbs or finitenesses in Finstar and the progressive, among other things, is an asp star. But the T domain, which we call the domain of the situation in situation semantics terms, is very rich in many languages. So as Cinque shows, you can get a lot of functors in that space. And so the question is, our task, I think, from the acquisition perspective is, how can we account for the rigidity, the cross-linguistic rigidity that has been documented by Professor Cinque in this domain, if this isn't a universal functional sequence? So I'm going to suggest a few different things, a few different aspects of acquisition that I think can account for this. So all of the positions, according to us then, in the T domain between fin star and asp star are in principle subject to variation. So if they don't vary, then there must be some reason. So we would say, or I would say, in the initial stage, T is underspecified in a way that's been discussed in the acquisition literature. And there's a University of Tromsø PhD on underspecified P at an early stage of acquisition, which then later develops into a rich structure. And in acquisition, I would assume that there's a bias against synonymy. So if the learner parses walks and walked as containing two different suffixes, then the learner has to posit a difference in the T domain if the difference is, or a difference somewhere. And if it has to do with tense, it's going to be located in the T domain because of the conceptual content of the T domain. Or between will walk and can walk, there's going to be different features which have to be innovated, right? As long as they're in complementary distribution, like will and can are in English, or like present and past are in English, then this will involve the positing of different lexical heads T, like a present T and a past T in competition with each other for the T position, or will and can as modals in competition for the T position. And those heads, since they're distinct heads, they can also have distinct formal features. So like in English, some modals behave differently. Shall behaves differently from may, and modals behave differently from tense. And these heads can be associated with different features, which are drawn from some kind of a toolkit or inventory of feature components. So here I'm citing David Adgers in my paper on features. But of course, in order to get something like the rich inventories that have been observed, we're also going to need to assume that T can be split. So sometimes the functional material in a domain can't be parsed with the learner's grammar, so the learner has to posit an additional head in the domain. So what are the principles that govern that splitting? So one of the principles one possible principle would be Dunbar and Wellwood's version of the complexity constraint, where they say, they call it the no containment condition. They say no head's semantic representation can contain another's. So if a learner correctly understands a present perfect and also has a present head, then the present perfect cannot be parsed as a single head because it contains the semantics of the present. So it has to be two heads. So this is a semantic constraint on the complexity of individual functional heads, which is going to lead to layering in the T domain. I would also want to assume a principle like the one that Gillian and I discussed in that paper, which we called compositional coherence, where we said, if X takes YP as a functional complement, then the denotation of XP is a monotonically coherent elaboration of the denotation of YP. So there's something about a natural part-whole structure which allows certain kinds of functional hierarchies to emerge and not others. And so I would assume that this could be derived from the acquisition strategy. It's just the simplest way to decompose a single T head into two T heads, or to decompose an XP into an X plus a complement YP. I have another paper from 2016 in a volume on complex predicates where I discuss this, the semantics of functional complementation in more detail. So I argue that it's a kind of a part-whole relation. So here's my summary of my theory of acquisition. Universal CTV, anti-synonymy bias causes heads to be differentiated. Universal toolkit of feature components like part-whole and coincidence, an anti-complexity bias, which causes heads to be split, and a coherence bias for functional complementation.
Okay. So I think that this lead us directly to the second question, and you, Peter, can go on answering as the first one.
Okay.
The question is,
all right.
What is the relevance of scope in determining functional hierarchies?
Okay, so yeah, I'm not 100% sure I understood the question right, but I'll talk for 5 minutes anyway. So so on my perspective then, I want to say that the CTV hierarchy has a different source from the hierarchies of heads within the T domain, right? So CTV, there's one explanation for that. And then within the T domain, when you see these fine-grained layers of structure, that's not necessarily going to follow from the same generalization, because the CTV domain hierarchy has to do with very broad brush concepts like proposition, situation, event. And certain things are attributes of situations which are not also attributes of events, like we argue time. So events are atemporal. They have to do with force dynamics and thematic structure, but they don't have time. If you add time to an event, then you have a situation, which is a different kind of thing. But that kind of explanation doesn't scale up well to a rich hierarchy, the kind of rich hierarchy that you see in individual languages. So we need different explanations. So for example, the reason that tense is higher than deontic modality is different from the reason that, let's say, the habitual aspect is higher than the repetitive aspect. So I'll just give a couple of examples. I'm not sure this one is scope, but Hackard in her thesis argues that epistemic modality is outside tense while deontic modality is inside tense. So for example, John had to be home has two readings. The deontic reading is a past obligation. So in the past, John was obligated to be home. The epistemic reading is a present necessity. It is necessarily true that, or according to whatever knowledge I have, I can conclude that in the past, John is home. So there's a clear, I think we can call it a scopal difference. Anyway, it's a difference in the layering structure, and it's maybe the difference between epistemic and deontic is completely derivative of that very difference. So we call it deontic because it's inside the scope of tense, and we call it epistemic because it's outside the scope of tense. So an epistemic modal is anchored to finstar, which is the utterance, and or which is connected to the utterance or to the attitude of an embedded clause, and a deontic modal simply isn't. There's also the possibility of functional inventories being layered by convention. So this is where we do see cross-linguistic variation. For example, English modals are always higher than non-finite aspectual functors, like the perfect. But, or another example is the frozen scope of some modals with respect to negation. So must not and mustn't always mean, in English, obliged not, whereas can't and cannot normally, without some kind of intonational break, always mean not permitted. So there's a kind of a lexicalization of these modal negation combinations, but we know that that's not universal. So the closely related and similar language Norwegian is different in these ways. So these cases of strict ordering are conventions. They're by convention, and the conventions that led to English doing this particular ordering might also apply in other languages, but not obligatorily. So you'll see some variation here. let's see. A lot of adverb pairs actually allow more than one scopal order. This is another thing that Gillian and I discussed in our paper. So you have pairs like they usually already have gotten up at 6, which would be their habit is early rising, but you can say they already usually have gotten up at 6 in case the attainment of the habit has happened earlier than expected. In some cases that Cinque discusses, he assigns different categories to the two categories, or to the two readings of the adverb, but we argue that in some of these cases, the difference really is due to the different position of the adverb rather than causing it, right? So, so we argue that some adverbs can adjoin to more than one category, and it may also be possible that adverbs can sometimes be adjoined to the same, the multiple adverbs can be adjoined to the same category, in which case the functional sequence isn't what's determining the order or the scope. So there's the summary, just what I just said. That just lists them, so I can leave it up.
It was very clear.
Oh, good,
So
thanks.
I think Memo could reply. You are perfectly timing us.
Right. Well, I had an answer to the question, and then I will also try to reply for at least one part. Now, the notion of scope is, I think, to be qualified in the sense that we are used to think of scope as being based on secomand for quantifiers, scoping over other quantifiers or over pronouns and so on. But the notion of scope relevant to functional hierarchies is richer in the sense that in addition to secomand, it involves the relative time or timing of composition with the predicate or the head of the projection, let's say in a noun. Now, a clear case is, I take up again Peter's case from Ackert of epistemic modality and tense. Now, clearly epistemic modality is higher than tense, or tense is closer to the verb and is composed with the predicate earlier than epistemic modality. But there is a very clear reason for that. I mean, it's an intrinsic kind of reason, in the sense that if you say John must have been home yesterday, or John was probably home yesterday, the speaker is suspending the commitment to the truth of the proposition that is uttering. So if it turns out that John was not at home yesterday, nobody can say you were a liar. You are a liar because you used the epistemic modality for that. Now, to have a proposition on top of which epistemic modality operates, you need to have tense. I mean, the predication has to be anchored in either present or past tense to be subject to being judged true or false. So there is an intrinsic relation between the two. Now, the question arises then, if all the relative scopes among functional projections can be derived this way, by the semantic composition that each functional element has with, say, the predicate or the noun. If that were the case, then we would not need to learn anything about functional hierarchies, And I still think that we don't need to, they cannot possibly be learned, whatever. And in some cases, there is no clear scope relation. For example, why should the prospective aspect, namely to be about to do something, be closer to and being composed before progressive aspect? This is not entirely clear. But let's suppose that a finer semantic analysis comes up with a perfect map of the scopes of every single functional head with respect to the other functional heads in all hierarchies. Then the question arises, are we entitled to say that UG has no role in this? that it's simply a product of our cognition. Can we simply say that these scopes, I mean, if you take the entire, and we are sure to scope rightly the elements together, are we going to say that this is completely outside of UG? I don't think so. And I think there are at least two considerations that militate against this idea of taking it out from UG. The first one, of course, I mean, surely the internal organization of the functional hierarchy cannot be in conflict with the cognitive semantic scope relations, especially if you think that the semantic interpretation of a phrase or a sentence is interpreted from the syntax. So that has to reflect somehow what ultimately is forced by semantic conditions, let's say. But for the computational, at least I think, for the computational part of narrow syntax, for coding, I mean, to build structures that can be interpreted at the CI interface, each functional head has to be hard-coded in UG, in the functional lexicon. A second more crucial motivation, of course, is that each functional head in the functional lexicon, as we already noted, is not independently motivated by cognitive reasons, because we know that our cognition is much richer and contains many things that simply are not coded grammatically. So again, we have to encode those that are coded grammatically within the functional lexicon. And I mean, that seems to be inescapable. I think that this was made actually by Luigi Rizzi and by you during your questions that I saw in the recording of last counter. So the fact that only few elements enter receive a grammatical encoding should make us think about the fact that they have to be somehow hard-coded within the functional lexicon, and they have to be within UG, because if they were not within UG, then we would expect to find languages that don't show those things, and that they recruit maybe things from culture, from cognition, which are never found if they were not coded in the functional lexicon, which itself is inside UG. So, for example, we could expect not to find, I mean, if you think of it, all languages have diminutives, all languages have demonstratives, all languages have an adjective like other, which we could very well do without. All languages have approximative numbers. And I mean, it seems that we could instead find things like safety or danger morphophonology, or magical number morphophonology, which is present in certain cultures as a magical number, not as morphophonology, of course. So another thing, it's the internal structure of the event is very well represented. I mean, it's prominently represented in all the aspects. But you also find emotions, but not all emotions. You only find some emotions. For example, you find surprise as in mirative mood in many languages, or adverbs. You find even commiseration. There are languages that have a suffix on the noun to express what we express with an adjective. When we say, my poor grandfather, that's commiseration. And it seems to be, again, but something that you find language after language. Yet you don't find any encoding of love, hatred, dislike, fear, anger, or for that matter, even physical sensations like hunger, thirst, pain. Why not? I mean, that remains to be understood. It's not obvious. So it seems to me that, to conclude, these hierarchies cannot be learned. I think this is also the conclusion that Chomsky, Gallego, and Oz had, although they also had something that I don't quite understand, namely that they pose an evolutionary puzzle. And that remains to be seen why, if it is the case. But certainly I would say they cannot be learned as such. I mean, it would be for all the reasons that I tried to. And if the composition, timing of composition is actually at the base of these scopes, then one can actually reconcile both cognition and semantics with UG, because both are involved. One cannot do without the other. So that is my...
Thank you. I think that it's not the case that many questions are common between the first topic about parameters and this one about functional hierarchies, because also one question is, are parameters within UG or outside UG?
They are within UG.
If they are within UG, how? Which is the space? And here too, also hierarchy, as functional hierarchies are within UG, outside UG. They are, if they are in, how? So there are two questions: yes, no. If yes, how? And we have to point our attention on the second one, how. I get, this is my position, but we will have time to discuss later, of course. So the final question, the third question, is the following. So does the same meaning necessarily correspond to only one structure, to only one derivation? Let's take an example of the grammatical concept of progressive aspect. You already cited it. Does it necessarily imply a functional head, progressive, or could it derive from different structure, possibly in different languages?
Mm-hmm. Who goes? Should I go? Okay.
You start.
Okay. So if by same meaning one intends the abstract meaning associated with a certain functional head, then I would say yes, there is a unique structure that corresponds to that meaning, irrespective of the material that the language recruits to express that meaning. Now, this needs again some qualification. Take the concrete example of progressive aspect. If one does a survey of how progressive aspect is expressed in the languages of the world, one finds at least 20 different ways, very different ways. So, for example, I just cite very quickly, I have a list here. So you have locative periphrases like be at, like in Danish, or be inside, or be in the middle in some Austronesian languages. You have be near in Piedmontese dialects, be behind in Veneto dialects. You have temporal periphrases. So it can be after, and verb to mean he's sleeping, he's after sleep, or be during in some Oceanic languages, or be in the course of, that's French or Romanian. Then you find the other periphrases, which are even more remotely connected, like be busy, like in Afrikaans. So you say he's busy dying, or he's busy sleeping, and or you find carry on, he's carry on sleep to mean he's sleeping, or hold in Yiddish, or have, or do. Then you also have other types of realization like tone, or reduplication, or meaningless particles, or prefixes, or no special morphology like Bulgarian. There you can only use the present tense. And of course, Italian has both progressive periphrases and the present tense. Now, this suggests to me that the child comes with a precompiled notion of progressive aspect, which corresponds, to paraphrase Partey's semantic analysis, something like it's an activity that takes place at a specific time point or small interval, which is in the present or the past or the future, which is part of a larger time span, which has no boundaries, initial or final, so it's open, and where the same activity carries on. This is more or less the semantic characterization of a progressive aspect. Now, languages, as we saw, recruit all kinds of things. They sometimes recruit words that recall some aspect of the aspectual meaning, like to be in the middle of. But sometimes they recruit totally opaque expressions. And that does not disturb the child. I mean, the child needs only, if he has a precompiled notion, a molecule that says this is the meaning of progressive aspect, he only has, or she only has to check in the context and see what kind of expression is used for that particular aspect. So in that sense, I would say yes, that the same meaning corresponds exactly to the same structure. Of course, if you take the different exponents with respect to that meaning, then there is no one-to-one correspondence, because, for example, to progressive aspect in Italian, you have two different exponents. You can have the present tense, piove, meaning it's raining, or sta piovendo, meaning it's raining, or to one form, present tense in Bulgarian, you have three different aspects. You have a generic, you have habitual, you have progressive, and you use just the present. This means that they all share some meaning component. I mean, the present is probably the most underspecified case that covers the others. Well, to finish, a confounding element, of course, is that we should be careful when we compare languages to think that a certain aspect in one language, a progressive in Italian, corresponds to the same aspect in English. Clearly, it does not, because there are many differences. For example, in English, you can say, apparently even in Spanish, he has been fishing for 3 hours. Now, in Italian, you cannot possibly say that. You cannot say, lui è stato pescando per 3 ore. We use another periphrasis. Lui è stato a pescare per 3 ore, which suggests, I think, that the English progressive has been expanded to cover a neighboring aspect that some typologists also distinguished, calling it durative progressive, as opposed to focalized progressive, which is more restricted. Then, of course, there are languages like Indian English, where the progressive periphrasis is even possible with stative verbs, so that you can say, I am knowing that you are coming tomorrow. So that means that we have to, when we compare languages, we have to decompose the features that are assembled in a different way in each language. Although I think that should not lead us to what typologists do, namely to say there is no way of comparing languages really, because every language has its own grammar, its own genus, to say, Sapiens. So I think if one goes down and decomposes these features, then there is a promise to be able to really compare languages and come to a better understanding of. So to conclude, I would say that there is both a yes answer to that question and a no answer, depending on how you define meaning or how you consider the exponent of meaning and the meaning relation. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Shall I jump in?
Yes.
Okay, so Yeah, I guess when I alluded to a toolkit of feature components, I kind of imagine that's why the progressive looks so similar from language to language, because languages have notion of time and notion of an event and notions of the toolkit. The semantic toolkit contains the means to construct certain kinds of meaning, but that doesn't mean that the progressive is already pre-constructed. So just that's what I would think. But I have a slide. I have a slide to answer the question.
Screen sharing, so please.
Okay. So now, whoops, I have to
This is the
go. Yeah, okay. So does the same meaning necessarily correspond to only one possible structure or derivation? Answer, no. So then I referred to another paper by myself and Gillian Ramchand from 2008 called Mapping a Parochial Lexicon onto a Universal Semantics. And there we discuss some cases where we think there are different syntactic structures for the same meaning. And one of the things we allude to is underspecification. So we argue that definiteness, different notions of definiteness are differently specified in the noun phrases of Norwegian, English, and Russian, where the syntax semantic system more fully specifies definiteness in some languages than others. And in those languages where definiteness is not as fully articulated, it's left up to negotiation at the conceptual intentional interface by other factors. So that's a kind of an underspecification story, which is at least one way in which I think the answer to the question is no. But another case is Daniel Harbour's analysis of number systems. He's got a very, very detailed, well worked out theory of number based on two important features, plus minus minimal and plus minus atomic, which are both necessary if you have a dual. If you have a singular dual plural opposition, then you need two features. But if you don't have a dual, if you just make the singular plural opposition, you can make do with just plus minus minimal or plus minus atomic. And for simple noun phrases, it won't be immediately obvious whether the system is plus minus minimal or plus minus atomic, but you can see it. So in Svan, in Upper Svan, which is spoken in Georgia, I think, you have a plus minus atomic system. And there's also an exclusive inclusive distinction in the first person. So the first person exclusive plus atomic is just I, and the first person exclusive minus atomic is we, meaning me in the third person. But if you have the first person and second person, it's never atomic because it always consists of two people, at least two people. So there's no one inclusive plus atomic. But Winnebago, the rest of the system looks the same as if it were singular and plural, but there's what looks like a singular first person inclusive, which means specifically I and you. So it's understood as a dual because that's the minimal unit that contains both first person and second person. So it's as if it has a singular plural distinction generally, but a three-way singular dual plural distinction just in the first person because of the inclusive. And so that's where you can tell that this is a plus minus minimal system and not a plus minus atomic system. And then Louisa Marti has recently argued that that same distinction accounts for whether languages use a plural with numerals or not. So in English, you say two boats and not two boat, but in Turkish, you say two boat and not two boats. And she argues that that's a clue that Turkish is really using a plus minus minimal rather than a plus minus atomic. So there's more than one feature in the toolkit which you can utilize to express plural. And UG doesn't tell you which one to use, so you wind up with these differences which are not immediately apparent. And I'll mention two more cases very quickly. One is the UMass project on quantification, where they talk about the difference between A quantification and D quantification. So some languages like Salish don't have D quantification, they don't have quantified determiners. They only have sort of adverbial quantifiers. So the way that you say we ate all the fish is something more like we completely ate the fish, but it's ambiguous between we ate all the fish and we all ate the fish, because the quantifier can affect the interpretation of the subject. So I just mentioned that quickly because I want to go on to my favorite example, which is from North Sami, in a paper that I wrote in 2012 called Drowning into the River. In North Sami, you have a locative case and an illative case. I mean, that's what they're called. So the locative case is for locations, like in the example A, if you run house locative, it means you ran around in the house. If you run house illative, it means you ran to the house, right? So that's why it's called the locative and illative. But surprisingly, so if you just look at that, it looks like English in and into. But surprisingly, changes of state use the illative to describe their location. So you get what looks like she drowned into the river, meaning she drowned in the river, or he built his house onto a hill, meaning he built his house on a hill, or I forgot the book into the store. If you forgot it when you were in the store and you left, there's a change of state. The book never actually left the store, so it didn't go into the store, but you use the illative there. So I argue that the semantic representations of the verb phrases are different. For John ran to the house in English, you combine a motion description with a path and they compose in a particular way. Whereas in North Sami, it turns out the illative is not really a path descriptor. So it isn't translatable as to the house. Instead, what we call the illative is a locative which composes with a lower part of the complex event of motion. So it's the location of the endpoint. It's the location of the result. So it really is a locative, whereas to the house in English really is a path, but visui in Sami, according to my analysis, is really just a location. So that's an example where the same meaning, John ran to the house, is expressed with two different structures. In English, the path expression is attached in a different way to the verb phrase than the illative expression is in North Sami. That's an example suggesting that we don't want to go on the sort of universal path, but it doesn't really bear on your progressive example, because you could still say, we could still argue about whether the progressive is a precomposed primitive that exists in the inventory to be assigned to a functional head in the T domain, or whether it has to be put together from parts. And I don't have Gillian Ramchand has recent work on the progressive in her newest book. So I would go to that for answers.
Sure.
Thank you, Peter. Can you end screen sharing? So perfect. So we can see what happens, what is happening in the chat space.
Right.
So thank you. Thank you both to Memo and Peter. You have been perfect with timing. I fear I was terrorizing you yesterday with my German attitude. But anyway, we have time for questions. I have many. I think that which I won't put, of course, because I already have taken much time. But I think it's really clear what you propose and which are the answer at the end of the three questions, because both of you assume that functional hierarchies are inside UG. The problem is how. And when Peter proposed this fixed structure, which all of us use in our introductory class to syntax, so the C domain, the tense domain, and the VP domains. So we have to define the structure in the space between using the Peter terminology between fin and asp, and to develop the rules to do that. Of course, we need an inventory of functional feature or functional heads to work on. So it's the matter of define a theory which is not yet fully developed, I guess, no? of functional hierarchies. So I think that we all agree on the necessity to have an inventory which we can call universal, a universal inventory of functional features. And this has to do with what we call, with what you both called semantic molecules. Also, it's not my field, but I don't know what we understand with semantic molecules. But for me, it's sure that we need an inventory of what we call semantic molecules. And then the question about the interface between a syntax or narrow syntax and the CI system could be addressed properly.
Right, I think so.
I think that I have to wait that Cecilia write me, who is...
I see a question.
Alessandra Boban Arsenievich is the first, then Rita Manzini, and then Ian Roberts.
Okay, so I didn't get the name of the first one.
Boban Arsenievich.
Okay, please. Hi.
Hi, hello. Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you, Peter and Guillermo, and the organizers as well. It was very pleasant to listen to the debate. So my question is, you discussed, it figured prominently the question whether the cartographic hierarchy is UG innate or not, and you mostly agree on this issue, just have different views on how it is. But my question would be, does it have to be innate within UG? How about it being innate at a more domain general cognitive level? So, you know, that it is a hierarchy that figures in other cognitive capacities such as navigation, arithmetic, I don't know, perhaps even in animals, because there's research showing, for instance, that rats, when they navigate, go first for death reckoning, then for visual color stimuli, then for geometric stimuli, and so on. So there are similar hierarchies elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Should I
Yeah,
say something?
you should answer.
Okay. Well, I think one has to distinguish two aspects of the hierarchy. In a sense, you can say it must be innate for the reason that I tried to express earlier, namely the fact that all languages show the same type of hierarchies, language after language. So it would be, if it were, you know, learned out of cognition, out of culture, out of something external to UG, you would expect to find a lot more variation that is actually found. Now, the question is, what is innate and what depends from external factors? Now, it's, I mean, you can think of it, I don't know if it's the right way to put it, but you can think of the functional heads as being the bricks that are contained in the functional lexicon. And the way you arrange the bricks is actually reflects something that has also an external nature. But the question is, you cannot simply say, I do away with the bricks, because my external nature will tell me how to compose a sentence. That cannot be done, because then you would expect to find all kinds of different types of languages where they recruit different types of, you know, cognitive tools. And so I think it's like, I mean, one could think it in this way, that at some point when UG was formed, we don't know, it was instantaneous, it was, I mean, that's a big, it was like a crystallization of something that was not in language. Now the question is, why did UG crystallize exactly the things that we find crystallized there? That's the real question. So I think there is still a sense in which we want to say that these hierarchies, you don't need to learn them. They are already part of UG. And of course, the relative scope must have some original nature outside even. I mean, as I said, cannot be in conflict with the cognitive, but at the same, and cartography in a sense if you think of the Luigi's work and my work and other people's work, is to try to come up with as many bricks as possible to find the inventory of what are actually the functional elements that populate UG. And I don't know if I was clear or if I was, but in a sense, I would still push for minimal learning, as we see, because I mean, children really manage very well. And if they had to discover the functional hierarchies, it will take them a lot more time, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know what Peter can say. That.
Want to add something? I would simply add that, of course, you need a typology of bricks, because when you build a house, you start with the biggest one and then...
Right.
You agree?
Composition.
Yes. Peter, do you want to add something or?
I often find it very difficult to know how to even address the question of whether something is specific to language or not. I mean, there's the question of whether things are universal in humans is one question, and whether it's because of something that's general cognition or specific to language, that I find often very philosophical. I mean, I don't know how I suppose we can try to construct experiments to see whether apes have evidentiality, but I don't know. Life's too short.
So I think it's better if we move to the second question. Rita Mazzini is.
Hi, people. I think I would like to pick up again what Alessandra said at some point. I think the debate today was strikingly similar to the debate about parameters. So essentially, there is an enormous amount of empirical work, right, which tells us about observed functional hierarchies. And the question is that we can keep talking about them as if they were real, and then we ask ourselves, are they primitive constructs of some type? Do they correspond to an albeit elementary independent organization of UG? Or are they an emergent construct? If they are an emergent construct, what could possibly derive them? And then the answers are the usual that Ian specifically proposed last week for parameters. They will essentially derive the perceived universal organization of functional hierarchies will derive from logical properties. So for instance, I don't know, there is a way to construct a situation which requires an event. So you can't have a situation without having an event. And also, don't forget the independently established principles of the computational component. So somehow, for instance, the argument structure, you can think of it as being a universally organized. I'm not a great fan. I don't really know much about the temporal, rather, I know a lot more about argument structure. I mean, you can think about it as being strongly universal in the sense that, you know, we know verbs that have two arguments, or they have one argument. If they have one argument, then it can be an internal argument, external argument. But somehow this is all meshed in with the phasal organization of the sentence, right? There are two probes. There are only two heads that can give visibility. So what comes first? The computational organization or some sort of functional hierarchy? So this was a comment more than a question, but I hope the sense of what I was saying was sufficiently clear. I think Cinque Memo is not really against this way of thinking, but I think Peter was arguing much more clearly in favor of this.
Mm-hmm. Peter?
Yeah, so I mean, I took the C over T over V distinction to be, yeah, one of, like you said, you build situations out of events. But then, for example, the epistemic over deontic was, both of them are modality, and you use different labels if you have a high modality as opposed to a low modality. So then there isn't really any, you're moving up in complexity, and we have different, you're moving up in complexity when you go from deontic modality to epistemic modality, and we have different names for the high one and for the low one, but there isn't a primitive hierarchy of epistemic over deontic. There's just that epistemic is deontic, is its modality plus something that deontic lacks. So that's, I mean, I think I'm in favor of trying to derive as many parts of the hierarchy by that kind of reasoning as possible. But you know, I don't claim to have all 15 of Cinque's T positions worked out in detail.
Well, yeah. In a way, the question is whether there is a research program along these lines or not, right?
Yeah, it's a research program. I mean, another example is I like Gillian's explanation of her hierarchy in it, initiation over process over result, in her 2008 book. She says, I mean, her suggestion is there isn't a primitive initiation over process over result. Instead, there's an interpretation of functional complementation such that if you have a state over an event, then that's interpreted as causation. And if you have an event over a state, that's interpreted as change of state, resultativity. And if you put the two together, you get a transitive change of, or a directed change of state.
You have been clear enough. So, but we have to go on. Otherwise,
sorry.
If Memo has nothing to add, or do you have something to add? So, otherwise,
well, yeah, I would say, for example, that I mean, clearly there are things that are very important to our life, like the vision of the different events. And as I said, I mean, the internal structure of the event, and I mean, all the aspects, durative, completive, progressive, prospective, etc., are clearly very important. But the question is, can they be really emergent rather than internal? In the sense that you stop there, because what is the reason why we should have encoded grammatically commiseration, but not danger, not love, not fear, not all of these things? I mean, clearly there is some kind of, as I said, certainly our UG reflects many things of the outside world. The real question is, why doesn't it reflect all of them? Or at the libitum, sometimes some others. I mean, I find it very difficult to think that we actually learn these things, even with, concerning the what Peter was saying, I still think that different scope of, let's say, epistemic modality and deontic modality are two different things, although they share something. I mean that's Kratzer's analysis of models, where he says that, where she says that essentially there is an obligation for a person, or there is an obligation to think something. So there is still an obligation throughout, but yet you have two different positions. And if you think of, languages differ as to how they use the same morpheme for things that appear in two different positions.
Sorry.
I probably stop here because
but we have plenty of questions, and I have
I am carried out
immediately to the question by Ian Roberts. Then we have a question from the web, and then other question, and I don't know if we will be able to accept every question who are on the table here. Ian, are you around? Ian Roberts.
I see him. I don't hear him.
No, I don't hear him.
I can't hear you, Ian.
Wait.
Here it is.
There.
Thank you. Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you, Peter, Memo, and Alessandra. The short version of my question is, are all functional heads created equal? The long version of my question is, if we look at the set of functional heads, so if we extrapolate away from the relations of relative prominence that are created by merge, and that give us the C-command relations among heads, and just look at them as a set, the question is, does that set have any further structure?
Yes.
So do we have, for example, it seems to me, for example, if you look in the cartographic literature, one thing that has emerged over 20 years of work is there's an informal notion of field. So people talk about the aspectual field and the modal field and the temporal field. And then it does seem, as Peter pointed out in his presentation, that in fact Chomsky's intuition that C, T, and V are somehow privileged as functional heads has some purchase to it. Then if we think in terms of cyclic domains, we have a higher level of organization at the level of, for example, phase heads or extended projections or something like that. So my question to Peter is, you implicitly had a little bit of hierarchy amongst hierarchies. How far would you want to take that and why, and what are the limitations? My question to Memo is the structure of the set of functional heads really flat?
A very quick reply.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, definitely.
Perfect. May we move to Memo?
Yes, I would be also very, well, it's not certainly not flat in the sense that we are used to think of the various projections as spines, where everything comes out of the spine. And I came to the conclusion that really it's very articulated, and each sub-projection has its own head, which can move. So in the nominal projection, it's not only the noun that moves, it's the adjective that moves, but it can move only within its maximal projection. And then you get all kinds of, so I'll stop here, but it's a long answer. Okay.
I think Cecilia to propose a question from the web. Cecilia, are you there?
He's busy answering.
He's not answering.
Oh, sorry, I was just busy going to my email account to read. So this is from Alexis Wellwood. And the question is, couldn't there be a privileged interface or part of cognition which grounds the functional hierarchy evolutionary? For instance, Chomsky suggested that generalization from a navigation system might be involved. If so, we might expect a rich encoding of spatial temporal information, which we do, and others in relation to action planning, for instance, modality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, very quickly, I don't know what Peter has to say. And I would say certainly it's plausible, although some things are left out, let's say emotions. So you have to take that into account, not only navigation, like the event might come into, you know, the necessity to orientate, to navigate in actual space with events around you. I'm sure that, but it's not clear, of course. My short answer, it's I'm not sure. It's not clear to me.
Yeah. No, there's some really, I think one thing I think is very interesting is the work in that tries to find commonalities among different feature systems. So for example, the stuff that comes out of Cannahale's coincidence feature, the idea that coincidence could be a common property to you know, to a spatial description, but also to a temporal description. Or, you know, sometimes people have different takes on the parallels between aspect and spatial representations. But I think those are, I find that enterprise really interesting. Daniel Harbour organized a conference recently called the Alphabet of Universal Grammar, trying to figure out what are the building blocks that are used in across different features. That's kind of partly partly goes in the direction of answering Ian's question as well.
Okay, I think there is a last question by Michelle Sheehan, right?
Yeah.
There you are. Yes.
Hi, everyone. So I put it on, people have answered it already on the thing, but other people, but I was wondering about, especially for Memo, I guess, when you talk about progressive aspect, and then you mentioned that it's different in different languages. So what does the concept actually look like as part of universal grammar then, if it can differ so much from language to language? And then also in languages where there's no overt grammatical expression of progressive aspect, how do we know that those languages have progressive aspect, or do they, you know, rather than it just not being expressed? Right.
Well, this is a very big question that has to do with the fact that I think it's a pity that a lot of minimalist literature doesn't treat the lexicon seriously, in a sense, both the functional lexicon and the non-functional, the contentive one. Because what you find, if you compare even words among languages, you hardly find one word exactly corresponding to the word of the next language. So if you take a very simple example, if you take English and Italian, we use sempre, which translates into English as early, soon, and quickly. I mean, if you say, sorry, not simply, but presto. Sempre has another kind of, so if you take presto, it translates into these three different, so it means, I think that the three, and it occupies different positions. So in Italian, if you use it as early, it has to follow the verb. So you, mi alzo presto, you cannot say presto mi alzo. They can even co-occur. You can say presto mi alzo presto, mi alzerò presto. As you say in English, I will soon wake up early. Now, why is it the case? And the same with aspects, you know. So what we need to do is to decompose the features that enter. So clearly, presto as early or presto as soon, they must share something in common. Let's say the beginning of a scale of different types, maybe of waking in the morning or in doing something. I don't know, whatever the semantics of those adverbs is. But it's important to decompose, because otherwise you will never be able to compare languages. And the same, exactly the same, if you take Bulgarian. Bulgarian does not have any periphrasis for progressive aspect. They use the present. Is that a problem? Not at all, because in a sense, the child has the concept of progressivity. He or she knows that it happens in a specific time point, which is internal to, and then he or she hears Vali, or let's say rains, and it can mean it always rains in London in winter, generic, or it's raining now. And they use the same, because the two, the present and the progressive must share something in common. And English progressive certainly, as this I think was noted by a number of grammarians, that English progressive from the old days has expanded its usages. Maybe Ian knows about that. And in the sense that, you know, a particular form can actually be, you know, extended to cover different types of functional elements. And we only, so I don't know if I answered Michelle, but I think they, I don't see particular difficulty in approaching comparison. It's a very difficult thing, of course, because we would have to know, I mean, the fine details, both semantically and syntactically, where they are located, of these elements. And it's not clear that we are just scratching the surface. So anyway, So this is my idea.
I think it was clear. If I can add just a final remark, I have always been fascinated by the fact that we can translate language one in language two, so we can translate. That means that there is a common base. As I'm really puzzled by people who tell me, but this word does not correspond perfectly to the other one. Of course it doesn't, but we can translate. That's a miracle. In every language it's possible to translate our one. But anyway, Cecilia want to say a final word, right?
Yes, so I think we had a lot of interesting questions. Some questions could not be asked, unfortunately, both from YouTube and from the Zoom people who came tonight. We will save them and we will try to send them to the speakers for a later reply. In any case, I think, you know, we can just now announce the next event. We have been doing 2 in a row, but, you know, this is from the organizational point of view quite heavy. So we decided to have the next one on Thursday, the 11th of June, always at the same time. The next discussants will be Luigi Rizzi from the Collège de France and Ángel Gallego from the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. And the topic will be phases and minimality, division of labor. I will send around the flyer as usual, sometime in advance, and I hope to see you all there. So once again, I would like to thank our graphic artist, Enrico Castro, our music director, Ake Matshuben, our security and organization guys, Tommaso Balsemin, Tommaso Mattiuzzi, Francesco Pinzin, Giacomo Presotto, and Yang Yusun, and the organizational committee of the Linguistic Aperitif, Chiara Gianollo, Alessandra Giorgi, Cristina Guardiano, Maria Teresa Guasti, Maria Rita Manzini, Elena Pagliarini, myself, Emanuela Sanfelici, and Alessandra Tomaselli. Thank you, everybody. I hope to see you all on June 11th. Stay safe.
Thank you. Well, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Have a nice evening. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Grazie, Memo. Grazie, Peter.
Grazie a te. Bye.
Noi da ospiti rimaniamo qua fino alla fine, quindi vediamo.